first. And we talked about it on the last podcast. You know, why does it automatically become this thing of like you're trying to disparage this person now because your politics tell you, you know,
you have to, you can't disagree. Cause that's funny. I was on a group chat and I'm not too, because I'm doing a lot of organizing and other work in this area right now that like, I'm not paying a ton of attention to like the details, but someone was like, now the police union chief in Minneapolis is like really going hard on George Floyd's criminal record. Right. And it's just, you know, and it's, first of all, I mean, like he has like 5 priors, right? And first of all, the first thing that strikes me is that he hasn't been in trouble like in 13 or 14 years, right? So then that's the thing that I was like, even if he, did something really horrible, it's like, dude, he has shown significant reform, at least in the fact that he hasn't had major contact with the criminal justice system. But like, I think a lot of this movement is like, even the underlying premises of the criminal legal system in America is like, we criminalize poverty, we over surveil and over arrest Black people, right? So even like, 3 of the 5 cases he has is just like possession of cocaine. And it's like, I don't give a
who doesn't like coke, all right?
That's actually, well, look, I want to say something after you finish,
So it's like, I don't give a fuck that he had cocaine on him. But like in a state like Minnesota, right? Like California, thank God we are in a place, maybe 6 years ago, we changed it so it's no longer felonious, right? So, but he went to prison several times just for simple possession of cocaine, right? A drug that so many people use in all kinds of classes and all kinds of colors, right? But like how many people use it without going to prison for 10 to 15 months, right? And then shocking, when he gets out of prison, right? It's difficult for him to readjust, to have a good job, to provide for his family, and then he commits other crimes. And it's like, oh, this is so stupid. And we invest so heavily in this like repetitive like caging of George Floyd. Yeah. And then now the Minneapolis police officer is trying to say, well, he's a career criminal. And that's really this dog whistle, right? That's like, he deserved to die, right? Because he was a bad guy, right? That's what they're trying to engender. And imagine if he was out there doing, and then they create this hypothetical, you might have killed your kid or drunk drive. And it's like, what are you talking about, right? Like, let's look at what happened. Like, he was subdued. There was no reason to kill him. And you killed him for 9 minutes.
Well, and the fact of how casual the fucking cop was. He had his hand in his pocket at one point, just kind of looking around. Yeah. It's like, dude, what the fuck? You are casually killing a human being in front of people, knowing that they're recording you. Like, how brazen is that?
You know what's so interesting? Like, that's just hearing that shit. That's the rhetoric, and especially that long 20-minute post that Candace Owens put out, right? Oh. And just listening to that's exactly what she was saying. It's like, why do we always have to highlight these criminals? And I'm like, in that situation, what did the cop know about his priors? He didn't know anything. He didn't know anything.
That he possibly used a fake $20 bill.
He just looked at him and he was like, clearly you used cocaine 3 times. I was like, what the fuck are you talking about, Candace Owens? Like, my God, dude.
Your brain cells die, man. Your brain cells die when you hear and read that type of shit.
And I already, even in her initial statement, when she goes, I just want to say, first of all, that, and I'm like, bitch, I already know. Like, I already fucking know. She goes, George Floyd shouldn't have been killed that way. I get that. But, where's your butt? Where's your fucking butt? And there it is.
But all I'm saying is all lives matter. That's what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah, right. And it's like, I want to get back to what you were saying about the coke.
Yes. Well, I wanted to ask you something, I guess, sort of related to that. Is from your experience, right? Like, what are your thoughts on these minimum sentence rules, right, against blue collar crimes and white collar crimes?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so like one of the things that gets kind of conflated a lot is like minimum mandatory sentencing, right? Yeah. And that's really prevalent in the federal criminal system. Okay, so which is very onerous and fucked up. So for example, there's people like, one of the big cases that came out in the Supreme Court was like some guy was selling 9 ounces of marijuana. He got sentenced to 40 years in prison. And this case went up on review to the Supreme Court. And it's like, dude, this guy's just selling fucking weed, right? Yeah. And the Supreme Court, this is probably in the 80s, and was like, no, that's fine. That's not cruel and unusual punishment, right? God. And so like now, and then we created so when you get into federal court on some of these like higher end possession cases, now obviously these are related to dealing, but even then I have questions about like, even if you're selling a pound of coke, it's like, is it really worth 5 to 10 years in prison, where in other developed countries, these kind of drug crimes carry like anywhere from 0 to 6 months or maybe a year, right? Even for like high volume, right? Because we understand that people are going to use drugs, people are going to commodify that selling structure, right? But in state court, which is the vast majority of people in the United States are incarcerated in the 50 courts, 50 state jurisdictions, right? we don't have that minimum mandatory sentencing as much. We do have like basically a lot of prosecutorial discretion in terms of charging, enhancements, and priorability, right? So up until recently, I'll use marijuana as a recent example. Marijuana just became legal, right? In California, recreationally, right? So, I mean, that first year I petitioned, like I remember getting one guy, a black man out of prison who was serving an 8-year sentence, okay? I don't even know how he was serving 8 years. It makes no sense to me. He sold 2 grams, on like 2 1 gram dub sacks to a recorded informant on 2 separate days.
That got him 8 years?
That got him 8 years.
Holy shit,
and like,
man.
And like that guy pled because he faced even more. He took a fucking deal for 8 years because he was facing.
That was a plea deal?
That's fucking
He
wild.
took an 8-year plea deal because he was so afraid that he would get 13 or 14, I think, after trial. And because they had a confidential informant, they had an officer watching the informant. I mean, he had no factual defense to this, right? I mean, he did it. He sold a gram of marijuana to somebody, right? And it's just like, so then he can't afford bail, right? Because it's like 150, it's some irrelevant amount to nobody could pay. I mean, I couldn't pay it, right? And so he couldn't afford bail. He has a public defender. Now the public defender is really now wheeling and dealing. Dude, you have this is the landscape, right? We can go to trial, but if we lose, this asshole judge who thinks it's his biblical mission to put you in prison for the rest of your life will give you 13 or 14 years. The DA is saying, I'll give you half of that or 2/3 of that. And he's like, I'm going to cut my losses, right? And so, and I got him out after serving, I think he was serving almost 4 or 6 of that sentence, right? And I mean, marijuana then becomes legal and then it's like, make an immediate petition and
That's
you're like, get this guy
insult to injury.
Right? And then what does the state give him? Is there any reparations? Is there any economic assistance? Is there any reentry programming? Does he get a preference in the marijuana industry to get a license because he was disproportionately impacted by draconian marijuana laws? Nothing. He gets nothing. He gets out of he gets released in the middle of the night and figure out your life, right? Well, so, but in terms of minimum sentencing, so we see that's what we see more in state court. We see a lot of these enhancements. Oh, well, if you've ever sold drugs, plus 3 years. If you have a strike prior, times 2 plus 5. And then you start seeing like, now all of a sudden you have like, if you have any criminal history, you're looking at 10, 15, 20 years and you're like, dude, anything the system just has got you by the balls basically. And you'll take anything to reduce your exposure or culpability. And it's very hard to see fighting these cases and winning when like, even the law is perverted in so many ways. Even when I have legitimate arguments under the black letter rule of the law, you'll see like judges make disingenuous arguments to like make your job harder because they don't want your guy to get out or they don't want to see someone get off on what they'll label as a technicality.
Well, I wanted to ask you because you talked about that high bail, right?
Yeah.
And so what are your thoughts then on the bail system? Like considering that there's a disproportionate amount of minorities from poor, like socioeconomic backgrounds who are getting arrested. And so the bail system almost seems to like reinforce like the wealth gap.
It does.
Right?
100%.
Yeah. And so it's like, it's basically saying if you're a person who comes from just decent amount of wealth, average wealth to above average wealth, who come from a place of privilege, you have the freedom to get yourself out.
And fight your case more aggressively.
Right. Right. Whereas if you're not, too fucking bad.
Yeah.
That's what you get for being poor, for being part of a system where there's not enough money put into education. Yeah. Right.
And it's funny because there's like, we're talking about the mythos or like the mythology of America is like about individualism and meritocracy. And it's like, well, how are you at 18 years old if I can't afford $50,000 bail? How is that my fault? Right. Like what have I done to say I don't have $50,000? Like I didn't choose that.
No, that's what you get.
But yeah, so like, I mean, there's been a lot of challenge to the American bail system recently, right? Because there's a lot of lawyers working in this area to say there's this fundamental premise that if you have money, you can buy justice, you can buy access. Like look at Roger Stone. He just recently stood trial, and this motherfucker, I mean, he fucking went on Instagram and put the federal judge that was trying his case, he put her in a crosshairs. And I mean, that's a fucking threat to me.
For sure. How do you take it any other? I promise you, it was a person of color who did that. It's a very different story.
They would have remanded his ass in a second and charged him with threatening a federal judge. And this motherfucker stays. Not only does he not get remanded into custody and saying like you're a public safety danger, you're making threats against people who are involved in your trial, right? They're like, just don't do it anymore, and like we're gonna monitor your internet. And it's like they're jumping through all these hoops not to remand him, right? And it's like, and back into custody. And it's like, well, why don't we do that for people of color or Black people or Indigenous people? Like, we don't offer those same kind of like chances. We just don't, right?
Because they don't see them as a
they
threat.
Don't. It's like, they're just
it's fucking ridiculous, dude.
Yeah.
But they also don't see them like the capacity of rehabilitation or the community value that they have. And so,
I mean, my question to that then is like, if, knowing all this stuff, right? If somebody were to argue against these points, right? What is something that they would bring up to that? They go, like, you tell somebody, like, listen, the system is put against them, especially when you put somebody and you incarcerate them for this bullshit, right? They come out, they can't get a job. They have to go back and it's cyclical constantly, right? So what does somebody say to you? They go, well, that's not true because...
Well, I think a lot of what people say is they'll cherry pick anecdotes to be like, well, look at this very heinous murder or this very heinous like crime, and then they really like to kind of dive into salacious details about how it's impacted certain people or like how this victim had something happen to them. Which, I'm not unsympathetic to victims' rights, right? Like I think that that's very important that we try to when someone has been traumatized by a crime, right? Like we need to listen to that person and offer them assistance and make sure that they get justice, right? But I think there's like two things that I respond to with those kind of salacious cherry pick details. One, a lot of times my clients come from communities in which they're victimized tremendously, right? Like they've been the victim of tons of violent crime or abuse or neglect in a lot of ways, right? They're also the victims of systemic violence, right? Like, I mean, when you arrest and incarcerate their parents and you don't invest in their healthcare and education, right? You lead to you help contribute to more violent outcomes in their life, right? So there's both individual like violence and there's systemic violence that we are contributing to in their life, right? And so that's the other thing. I also think, like we were talking about earlier with your dad, like there's a lot of opportunity for victims to be involved and to like actually have like rehabilitation. Like putting someone in a cage, the evidence shows it doesn't really help. It doesn't deter that person from committing another crime. It doesn't give them the feelings of behavioral psychology to be like, you know what, I made a mistake. I'm never going to do that again. Like that doesn't work like that.
Because it's not a correctional facility.
But
that's not what it is.
But if you have like, I mean, what does work, what we are seeing working is like if someone who has been the victim of, let's say a looter is sat down with the owner of the store and someone who has the appropriate expertise and ability to mediate this can say, look at the harm you committed to this family. And they actually see the pain and they see the cause and they have this is how this made me feel. This is why I did it. You see that there is actually dialogue, and the studies do show that these restorative justice programs actually contribute to much better outcomes, right? On both ends, right? Like this other person will get, oftentimes, they'll contribute resources to making sure that they're whole. And then this person who committed the crime is like, oh, now I really understand the consequences of my action. And I'm not going to do that anymore and I'm going to try to do things to get out of this lifestyle or make those bad choices that I made.
It's kind of like the whole positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement, right?
Like for like mammalian behavioral psychology, right? Like if you give people like this idea of like understanding it like on a higher level, as opposed to just saying, we're going to put you into a cage. I mean,
there's just a bunch of Asian parents, dude, just fucking negative reinforcement. Just trying to beat everybody's ass into submission, dude. Oh shit.
Well, we're the victims of that. So
that's fucking crazy. You guys went to the same high school. I'm so surprised because I found out so many things about Whitney being like a highly accredited school. Yeah. And this fool went there.
Hey, what are you trying to say, man?